I'm going to be honest with you about something. I don't know if anyone is ever going to hear this recording. The batteries in this handheld unit are down to maybe 40 minutes of runtime. And I've been sitting here in the dark for 3 days, trying to decide whether it was worth using them on this. But I think it is. I think someone should know what happened at the Caldwell Ridge Relay Tower, and what we found out about the infected, and what we did to each other up there on that mountain. Because the things that happened weren't just about the dead coming back. The worst parts were about the living. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 37 years old. I was a radio communications technician for the Bridger County Emergency Services Network. That's a fancy way of saying I drove a county truck to remote towers, replaced corroded antenna cables, swapped out failing repeater boards, and kept the system alive so that when a cop or a paramedic keyed their radio, their voice actually went somewhere. I wasn't a hero. I wasn't a survivalist. I was a guy who understood wiring diagrams and signal propagation and how to solder a connector in freezing rain. That's all. And that's the only reason I'm still alive. Before everything, I lived in a rental duplex on the east side of Harlow, a town of about 9,000 people in the foothills. My mother lived 20 minutes away in an assisted living facility called Pinecrest Gardens. She had early-stage vascular dementia. Some days, she knew exactly who I was and would tell me I needed a haircut. Other days, she'd call me David, which was my father's name. He'd been dead 11 years. I visited her every Sunday and every Wednesday evening, and I called her every other day, and I told myself that was enough. It wasn't, but I told myself that. The first warning I got wasn't on the news. It was in the signal. 3 Thursdays before the collapse, I was up at the Black Rock repeater site doing a routine check. The repeater handles relay traffic for fire and EMS across the northern part of the county. When I powered up my test set and monitored the input frequency, I heard something wrong. The channel was supposed to be idle, but there was traffic bleeding in from outside our system, fragments of transmissions on adjacent frequencies, panicked voices, clipped phrases. I caught the words containment and non-responsive to commands, and something that sounded like they're still moving. It was faint. Probably skip propagation bouncing signals from hundreds of miles away. I logged it and reported it to my supervisor, Dale, who told me it was probably a military exercise and to finish my PM checklist. I finished the checklist, but I kept my scanner running on the drive home. And for the next 4 days, I kept hearing things, not on our local frequencies, on distant ones, federal bands, freaks I wasn't supposed to be monitoring, but had programmed into my scanner years ago out of professional curiosity. There was a pattern forming, a sharp increase in encrypted traffic on certain government channels, followed by sudden silence, like someone was talking urgently and then getting shut down. Meanwhile, the news was carrying a story about a respiratory illness cluster in 2 cities I'd never been to. The coverage was calm, measured, the kind of tone they use when they don't want you to worry but also want to be able to say later that they told you. I watched it on my phone during lunch breaks and felt something in my stomach that I couldn't name. It wasn't panic. It was recognition. The same feeling I get when I'm testing a system and the readings are just slightly off in a way that means something deeper is failing. Then the local hospital went quiet on the radio. I need to explain what that means. Harlow Regional Medical Center was a small facility, maybe 80 beds. Their internal communications ran through a system I'd helped install 4 years earlier. They had a maintenance contract with the county, and I was the one who serviced their equipment. I knew their traffic patterns the way you know the sound of your own house at night. And on a Tuesday morning, 11 days before the full collapse, their radio traffic dropped to almost nothing. Not a gradual decrease. A cliff. 1 hour they were running normal dispatch coordination with county EMS, and the next hour, silence. I called their facilities manager. No answer. I called the main line. It rang 19 times. I counted. Then someone picked up, and I heard breathing and what sounded like a television playing very loudly in the background, except it wasn't a television. It was screaming. Not one person. Many people in a large room, the sound diffused and echoey the way it gets in those long hospital corridors. The person on the phone didn't say anything. They just breathed. Then the line went dead. I drove to the hospital. I got as far as the parking lot. There were vehicles at strange angles, some with doors open, some with engines still running. I saw a woman sitting on the curb near the emergency entrance. She was in scrubs. She was holding her own arm against her chest, and even from 50 yards away, I could see the fabric was soaked dark. She was rocking, just rocking, staring at the ground. I started to get out of my truck, and then the emergency doors opened, and 2 people came out. And the way they moved made me get back in and drive away. I'm not going to describe it in detail. You've all seen them by now, or you've heard descriptions, or you haven't survived long enough to need one from me. But what I will tell you is this. The first time you see someone you might have known, someone who looks like they could be your neighbor, wearing clothes you'd see at the grocery store, moving like that, with that absence behind their eyes, your brain doesn't process it as a monster. It processes it as a sick person. And that hesitation, that very human moment of empathy, is what kills people in the first wave. Because you stand there thinking, I should help them. And by the time you understand that the person you're looking at is gone, they're already too close. I drove home. I locked my doors. I sat on my kitchen floor and called my mother's facility. The phone rang and rang. I called my sister in Portland, straight to voicemail. I called my ex-wife, Janine, not because I expected her to care, but because she was the only other person I could think of who might pick up. She didn't. I called 911. The line was busy. That's the moment, if I'm being precise. That's when I knew. Not when I saw the people at the hospital. Not when the radio went silent. It was when I called 911 and got a busy signal. In 20 years of working adjacent to emergency services, I had never once heard a busy signal on 911. The system is designed with overflow routing, automatic call distribution, mutual aid failover. For that line to be busy meant the entire structure had been overwhelmed. And if the structure was overwhelmed, then whatever was happening wasn't a cluster, wasn't contained, wasn't going to be on the news tomorrow with a reassuring update. So here's what I did in the next 6 hours. And I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that even someone who should have known better still almost got it wrong. First, I packed food, but I packed wrong. I grabbed canned goods, but forgot a manual can opener. I took bottled water, but not enough, only about 2 gallons, because I kept thinking the taps would stay on. I gathered my battery bank and charging cables and my emergency hand crank radio. I packed clothing for 3 days, which tells you how delusional I still was about the timeline. Second, I tried to reach my mother. I drove to Pinecrest Gardens. The front door was locked. Not locked like it normally was, with the electronic keypad. Locked with a physical deadbolt from inside and chairs stacked against the glass. I could see through the lobby windows. The lights were on. The reception desk was empty. I banged on the glass for 10 minutes. Finally, a man appeared. Not staff, a resident I half recognized, wearing a bathrobe and carrying a fire extinguisher like a weapon. He shook his head at me. He mouthed something. I think it was, "Go away." I pressed my county ID badge against the glass. He shook his head again. Then he looked over his shoulder at something I couldn't see, and his face changed, and he moved away from the window fast. I went around to the side entrance. The service door was ajar. I could hear something inside, a rhythmic thumping, like someone hitting a wall. I stood at that door for what felt like an hour, but was probably 90 seconds. And then I did something I will never forgive myself for. I left. I got back in my truck, and I drove away from my mother. I told myself I would come back with help. I told myself she was safer inside, with the doors locked. Then she would be with me trying to extract her, while whatever was making that noise was still in the building. I told myself a lot of things. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I was afraid. And I chose myself over her. That was day 1. By the end of day 2, Harlow was emptying. Not the way cities empty in the stories, no dramatic exodus, no highways jammed with honking cars. It was quieter than that. People just stopped being visible. The grocery store parking lot, which had been a chaos of desperate shoppers the previous afternoon, was empty except for abandoned carts and scattered plastic bags blowing across the asphalt. Houses that had been lit up the night before were now dark. Cars that had been parked in driveways were gone, and the ones that remained had their curtains drawn and their doors sealed. I drove through neighborhoods I'd known my whole life, and the silence was worse than any sound could have been. I'd always thought an apocalypse would be loud. It wasn't. It was the quietest thing I'd ever experienced. No engines, no dogs barking, no kids, no lawnmowers or distant music or any of the sounds that form the background radiation of a living town. Just wind, and occasionally, from somewhere you couldn't pinpoint, a sound that might have been a voice and might have been something else. I saw a man I knew, Terry Purcell, who owned the hardware store. He was standing in the middle of the road on Elm Street, just standing there, not moving, facing away from me. I slowed down. I almost called out to him. Then I noticed his posture, the slight list to one side, the way his arms hung. I drove past at 5 miles an hour, and as I passed, his head turned to track my vehicle, but his body didn't move. Just his head, rotating smoothly, following the sound of my engine. His eyes were open, but they weren't seeing me. They were hearing me. That was when I first started to understand about the sound. I drove to the county maintenance yard where we kept our equipment. The gate was open. 2 of our service trucks were gone. Dale's office was empty, his computer still on, a coffee mug still warm. I grabbed everything I could think of: a portable repeater kit, spare batteries, coaxial cable, hand tools, a signal generator, 2 handheld radios fully charged, and the keys to the Caldwell Ridge Tower. Caldwell Ridge. I need to explain why I thought of it. The Caldwell Ridge Relay Station sits at about 6,000 feet on a mountain 12 miles outside of town by road. More like 7 if you knew the fire trails. It was built in the 1960s as part of the Cold War Civil Defense Communication Network, decommissioned in the 1980s, and partially reactivated in 2004 when the county needed additional repeater coverage for the northern wilderness areas. The tower itself is a standard lattice structure, maybe 120 feet. But the real value is underneath. The original installation included a small underground service bunker, 3 rooms connected by a narrow corridor, with a reinforced steel door at the entrance. Built to survive the kind of world-ending scenario that the Cold War planners took seriously. The county had used 1 room for equipment storage and mostly ignored the rest. I'd been up there maybe 15 times over the years for maintenance. It had a generator. It had a locking steel door. It was on top of a mountain with clear sight lines and a single access road. And it had a working antenna connected to the emergency broadcast network. That last part mattered most, because in the chaos of those first days, when the cell towers were failing and the internet was dying and the broadcast stations were going off the air one by one, the thing that people needed most was a voice. Someone telling them where to go. Someone telling them what was safe. And I knew how to put a voice on the air. Getting there nearly killed me. The main road out of Harlow winds through a corridor of residential neighborhoods before climbing into the foothills. In normal times, it's a 25-minute drive. It took me 4 hours. Not because of traffic, because of what was on the road. I learned 3 things on that drive. First, abandoned cars are not just obstacles. They're hiding places. For them and for people who are not yet them, but are close enough to be dangerous. I came around a bend and found a minivan sideways across both lanes. Doors open, a child's car seat visible in the back. I stopped. I sat there, staring at that car seat for a long time. Then I heard glass breaking somewhere behind me, and I put my truck in reverse and found another way. Second, the infected were attracted to engine noise, but their response wasn't uniform. Some ignored vehicles entirely. Some turned toward them slowly, the way you'd glance at a passing truck on a normal day. But a few the ones that moved faster, the ones whose deterioration seemed less advanced, those reacted sharply. They came toward engine sound with purpose. Not running, not yet, not in the daylight, but walking with a directness that made it clear the sound was pulling them. Third, living people were more unpredictable than infected ones. At a gas station about 6 miles out of town, I saw a group of 4 men with rifles standing around a pickup truck. They watched me approach. One of them raised a hand, not a wave, a command to stop. I didn't stop. I accelerated. In the rearview mirror, I saw one of them raise his rifle, but he didn't fire. I don't know what they wanted. Fuel, maybe. My truck, my supplies. I'll never know if they were good people or bad ones, and that ambiguity is its own kind of horror. The fire trail that leads up to Caldwell Ridge is unmarked and gated. I had the key. I unlocked the gate, drove through, locked it behind me. The trail climbs through dense pine forest for about 4 miles, switchbacking up the mountain. It's rough, barely maintained. And on that day, it felt like the longest road I'd ever driven. The trees closed in overhead. The light went gray and green. I couldn't see more than 50 feet in any direction. And every shadow between the trunks could have been anything. But nothing came out of the trees. And when I finally crested the ridge and saw the tower standing against the sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in days. Not hope exactly, more like the sense that I had a task, that I knew how to do something that mattered. The bunker was exactly as I remembered. Cold, damp, and neglected, but structurally sound. The entrance was a heavy steel door set into a concrete frame. hidden beneath a corrugated metal awning that had been painted to match the surrounding rock. You had to know it was there to find it. Inside, a steep set of metal stairs descended about 15 feet to the main corridor. 3 rooms branched off. An equipment room with the repeater racks and an old desk. A storage room with metal shelving and county emergency supplies, some of them decades old. And a smaller room that had probably been a rest area for the original Cold War operators, with a cot and a sink that no longer worked. The generator was a diesel unit mounted in a ventilated alcove near the equipment room. It was old but functional. I'd serviced it myself 8 months earlier. The fuel tank was about 3/4 full, maybe enough for 10 to 12 days of intermittent use if I was disciplined about it. I spent the first 3 hours taking inventory. The emergency supplies included 2 cases of MREs that were probably a decade past their stated shelf life, a first aid kit with basic bandages and antiseptic, a box of emergency candles, a hand crank emergency radio, 2 wool blankets that smelled like mildew, and a 5-gallon water jug that was half full. The equipment room had tools, spare cable, connectors, and the repeater itself, which was still powered down from the last time the county had deactivated it. I fired up the generator. The sound of it starting was both comforting and terrifying comforting because it meant power, light, communication. Terrifying because it was loud, and I was already learning that loud was dangerous. But the generator was inside the bunker, in its alcove, and the ventilation shaft exhausted through a pipe on the far side of the ridge. The sound outside was muffled. Not silent, but muffled. I powered up the repeater. I connected my handheld to the system and began monitoring. For the first hour, there was nothing. Just static across every channel, that hollow hiss that sounds like the space between stars. Then, on the county emergency frequency, I heard a voice. Faint, broken, the signal clipping in and out. A woman. She was saying something about a school. She was saying there were children. She was asking if anyone was listening. I keyed the mic. This is Caldwell Ridge Relay, County Emergency Technician Marcus Hale. I hear you. What is your location? Over. Static. I repeated the call, adjusted the squelch, tried boosting the output, called again. Nothing. She was gone. Either her battery died, or she moved out of range, or something else happened. I sat there with the mic in my hand and listened to the static and felt the weight of every mile of empty air between me and whoever she was. That night, at Wondernerbo, I sat in the equipment room with a single emergency candle burning and ate an MRE that tasted like cardboard, seasoned with regret. I tried not to think about my mother. I tried not to think about whether she was still sitting in that facility, confused, wondering why no one was coming to help her. I tried not to think about whether she was still her. I failed at all of these. I slept on the cot in the back room. Or rather, I lay on the cot and stared at the concrete ceiling and listened to the generator hum and the static whisper and the wind howl against the mountainside. And sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard something on the radio. Not a voice, not static, a pattern. It was a slow, rhythmic pulsing on a frequency I didn't recognize. Not one of the standard emergency channels, not a commercial band, not anything I could identify. A low, oscillating tone that rose and fell in a cycle of about 4 seconds. It didn't sound mechanical. It didn't sound natural. It sounded intentional, like something was sending a signal. but in a language I didn't know. I recorded it on my phone. I tried to triangulate the direction using the antenna, but I couldn't get a fix. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere. After about 20 minutes, it stopped. The silence that followed was more disturbing than the sound had been. I told myself it was interference, atmospheric noise, a malfunctioning transmitter somewhere. I told myself a lot of things that first week. On the fourth day, they came. I was up top, outside, checking the antenna connections in the gray morning light, when I heard the gate down at the fire trail. Not the sound of it opening, the sound of someone hitting it. Metal on metal. Then voices. Distant, carried up the mountain by the still air. I grabbed my binoculars and moved to the overlook. 3 people at the gate. 2 men and a woman. One of the men was tall and lean, wearing a hunting jacket. The other was shorter, heavier, in civilian clothes, khakis, and a flannel shirt. The woman was young, maybe mid-20s, with a backpack and a baseball cap pulled low. They had a vehicle, a battered SUV, but they'd stopped at the locked gate and were debating what to do. I watched them for 15 minutes. They didn't look infected. Their movements were coordinated, purposeful, human. They argued. They gestured. The tall man tried to climb the gate, and the shorter one pulled him back. The woman sat on the hood of the SUV and put her head in her hands. I could have stayed silent. They never would have found the bunker. The trail wound up the mountain through heavy forest, and the bunker entrance was hidden enough that you could walk within 20 feet of it and miss it. I could have let them give up and drive away, and kept the bunker and its dwindling supplies for myself. But the woman on the hood of that SUV reminded me of someone. Not anyone specific, just the posture, the exhaustion, the way she held herself, like she was trying to keep from falling apart. And I thought about the woman on the radio, the one asking about children. And I thought about my mother, behind that locked door, and the man in the bathrobe who had shaken his head at me. I keyed my handheld on a common frequency. Vehicle at the fire trail gate. This is the Caldwell Ridge relay station. Identify yourselves. Over. The tall man nearly dropped the gate. The shorter one spun around, looking up the mountain. The woman raised her head. After a moment, the shorter man pulled a radio from his belt, one of those cheap FRS handhelds you can buy at any sporting goods store. Hello? Who is this? We're just trying to find somewhere safe. We heard there might be a relay station up here. Is there anyone there? Over. His voice was shaking. Not the way someone's voice shakes when they're faking fear. The way it shakes when they've been afraid for days and they've finally found something that might be an answer. I gave them the gate code. I told them to drive up slowly and to turn off their engine 200 yards from the summit and walk the rest. I told them I would meet them outside. They did exactly as I asked. And when they walked out of the trees and saw me standing there by the bunker entrance, just a tired man in a county maintenance jacket holding a radio, the shorter man started crying. He tried to hide it. He turned away and wiped his face. But I saw. Their names were Owen Price, the shorter man, a pharmacist from Harlow who had been trapped in a store for 2 days before escaping. Elaine Marsh, the woman, a graduate student who had been visiting the area when everything collapsed. And Graham Sutherland, the tall one, a retired park ranger from 2 counties over who said he'd been moving north, looking for higher ground. Graham was the one who worried me from the beginning. Not because he was hostile, He was controlled, calm, competent. He asked about the bunker's ventilation system. He asked about the generator's fuel consumption rate. He asked about exits. These were all reasonable questions. But he asked them the way someone asks, who is evaluating a resource, not seeking shelter. I noticed. I filed it away. Owen was the opposite, openly frightened, openly grateful, openly emotional. He had a canvas bag from his pharmacy that contained antibiotics, painkillers, anti-inflammatories, bandages, and a blood pressure monitor. He'd grabbed what he could before he'd fled. When he showed me the bag's contents, his hands were still trembling. I didn't know what we'd need, he kept saying. I just took everything I could carry. Elaine was quiet. She had a cut on her left forearm that she'd bandaged herself. She said she'd gotten it climbing through a broken window 2 days earlier. She moved carefully, like someone trying not to take up too much space. She barely spoke the first day. When I showed them the bunker and explained the systems, the generator, the water situation, the radio, she listened intently but asked no questions. That first night together, we sat in the equipment room under the fluorescent light powered by the humming generator, and we told our stories. Owen described barricading himself in the pharmacy while infected pounded on the shuttered windows. Graham talked about watching a group of hikers he'd been guiding turn on each other when one of them got bitten. Elaine said very little about her own experience, only that she'd been staying at a motel near the university when the emergency broadcasts started, and that she'd been moving since. I told them about my mother, about leaving. Owen put his hand on my shoulder and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. We established a routine. Generator on for 4 hours in the morning, off for 6, on for 2 in the late afternoon, off overnight. This would extend our fuel to maybe 18 or 20 days if we were careful. During power-on hours, I would monitor the radio, scanning frequencies, sending out a repeating emergency broadcast on the county channel and 2 federal emergency frequencies. The message was simple. This is Caldwell Ridge Relay Station. If you can hear this, you are not alone. Transmit your location and status. Assistance is limited, but we are monitoring. Over. For the first 3 days, nobody answered. Then, on the morning of the 4th day after the group arrived, I picked up a response. It was a man's voice, clear but distant. Caldwell Ridge, this is a mobile unit, approximately 60 miles south-southeast. We have 11 people, including 3 children. We have transportation, but limited fuel. Can you provide coordinates to a safe location? Over. My hands were shaking as I wrote down the information. I gave him the coordinates for the fire trail gate. I explained the route. I told him what to expect. He repeated it back. Then he said, "We've been listening to your broadcast for 2 days. You're the only signal we've found. Whatever you're doing, don't stop. Over." I looked at the fuel gauge on the generator. I looked at the math I'd written on the back of an old maintenance log. And I made a decision that I would later regret. I increased the broadcast hours. More power, more time on the air, more fuel burned. Because if there were 11 people 60 miles away who needed that signal, there might be others. And the whole reason I'd come up here was to be a voice in the darkness. Graham disagreed. He didn't argue openly, that wasn't his style. He simply pointed out once, calmly, that every additional hour of generator runtime shortened our window. When the fuel runs out, he said, we lose everything. Light, heat, communication, security, everything. was right. I knew he was right. But I kept the broadcast running anyway. That was my first emotional mistake. It wouldn't be my last. The 11 people never arrived. I called for them every morning for a week. On the third day, I heard the man's voice again, fragmented, barely audible. He said something about the road being blocked. He said something about a bridge. Then the signal broke up, and I never heard from him again. I didn't tell the others. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would break something. The fragile sense of purpose we'd built around the radio. The idea that what we were doing mattered. Or maybe I was just tired of being the one who delivered bad news. It was Owen who discovered the pattern with the infected and sound. He'd gone up to the surface. We tried to limit time outside, but we needed to check the perimeter, collect rainwater, and occasionally forage from the maintenance shed near the base of the tower. He was standing near the shed when a group of infected emerged from the tree line, about 300 yards down the slope. 4 of them. They were the slow kind, the ones whose deterioration was more advanced, who shuffled and swayed like damaged machines running on fading batteries. They weren't moving toward him. They were just present, drifting aimlessly at the edge of the forest. Owen froze. He stood perfectly still for what he later told me was 20 minutes. The infected didn't approach. They didn't seem to notice him. They milled at the tree line, bumping into each other occasionally, then slowly drifting back into the shadows. Owen returned to the bunker white-faced and trembling. "They couldn't see me," he said. "Or if they could, they didn't care. But when I shifted my weight and my boots scraped the gravel, just a little scrape, 2 of them stopped and turned toward me, exactly toward me, like they were listening. We tested this, carefully, from the safety of the bunker entrance, using the heavy steel door as a barrier we could seal. I used a portable speaker connected to my phone and played a low tone, setting it outside at a distance. The infected at the tree line responded within seconds. They turned. They moved toward the sound. Not fast, but with a directness that confirmed what Owen had suspected. When I cut the sound, they slowed, milled, lost focus. When I played it again, they reoriented. Sound was the primary trigger. Not the only one. They still responded to movement, to visual stimuli at close range. But sound was what pulled them from a distance, what gave them direction and purpose, which meant the generator was a problem. The bunker muffled it. The ventilation shaft carried the exhaust to the far side of the ridge. But it wasn't silent. If you stood at the bunker entrance with the door open, you could hear the low thrum of the diesel engine reverberating through the concrete. And if the infected were learning if their sensitivity to sound was increasing, which is what I was beginning to fear then, every hour that generator ran was a signal fire. I started the generator log that night. I tracked fuel consumption to the 10th of a gallon. I calculated runtime per day, days remaining, and the minimum power needed to maintain the broadcast. The math was not encouraging. It was around this time that I began to notice things about Elaine. She was always awake before anyone else. She spent time in the storage room alone. She had developed a habit of touching her left forearm, the one with the cut, and then looking at her hand, studying it, as though checking for something. And she'd started sleeping with her back to the rest of us, facing the wall, her jacket pulled up around her neck, even though the bunker was not that cold. I told myself I was being paranoid. The cut was healing. She'd let Owen clean it and rebandage it on the second day, and he'd said it looked fine. A clean laceration, No signs of infection, normal wound. But here's the thing about trust in a situation like ours. It doesn't break all at once. It erodes. You notice something small. You explain it away. Then you notice another thing, and another. And each one alone is nothing. But together, they form a shape. And one night, lying on my cot, unable to sleep, I realized the shape they were forming was fear. On day 9 at the tower, day 13 since the collapse began, I heard the pattern again. The same oscillating tone I'd picked up my first night. Same frequency, same 4-second cycle, but louder this time, closer. I was alone in the equipment room. It was the early morning hours. The others were sleeping, and I sat there with headphones on and listened to it for 45 minutes. It rose and fell like breathing. And this time, at the very end, just before it stopped, I heard something underneath it. A voice. Not words, just the cadence of speech buried under the tone, like someone talking through a wall of static. I ran the frequency through every identification protocol I knew. It didn't match any standard allocation. It wasn't a commercial station, wasn't a government band, wasn't amateur radio. It was something else. And it was getting stronger. The next morning, I found Graham outside at dawn. He was standing at the overlook with his binoculars, scanning the valley. Normal behavior for him. He took the morning watch most days. But when I approached, he turned quickly and lowered the binoculars. And there was a moment, just a fraction of a second, where his expression was wrong, not surprised, guilty. "Morning," he said. "Quiet night." "Was it?" I asked, because I'd heard the tone again, and I wanted to know if he had too. "Dead quiet," he said, and something about the way he said it made my skin tighten. I went back inside and checked the radio log. We kept a handwritten log of all transmissions sent and received pinned to the wall above the desk. It was my system, my protocol. And that morning, I noticed something I should have caught sooner. The log showed a gap. 2 hours the previous night, when the repeater had been active, the power draw confirmed it. But no transmissions were logged. Someone had used the radio and hadn't recorded it. I didn't confront Graham directly. I wasn't sure it was him. But I started paying closer attention. And then, on day 11, the outsider arrived. We heard him before we saw him. A voice shouting from down the trail, raw and desperate. "Hello, is anyone up there? Please, I can see the tower, please." We gathered at the bunker entrance. Through the binoculars, I could see a man climbing the trail on foot. No vehicle. He was stumbling, exhausted, wearing a torn jacket and carrying nothing. He was maybe 40, maybe 50, hard to tell from that distance. He kept shouting. And every shout made me flinch because I knew what sound did to the infected. And his voice was carrying down the mountain like a beacon. "We have to let him in," Owen said immediately. Graham said nothing. He watched through his own binoculars with an expression I couldn't read. "He's making too much noise," Elaine said quietly. It was one of the longest sentences she'd spoken in days. "If there are any of them on the mountain, they'll be coming." She was right, and the man kept shouting. I went out to meet him. I moved fast, staying low, and intercepted him about 100 yards down the trail. Up close, he was in worse shape than I'd thought. His face was scratched, his hands were raw, and his eyes had the glazed, unfocused look of someone who had been running on adrenaline for days and was reaching the end of it. "My name is Carter," he said. "Dennis Carter. I had a cabin down in the valley. They came through 2 nights ago. I've been walking since. Please." I heard the broadcast, the one on the radio. "That's you, right? You're the ones on the radio?" I brought him inside. What else was I going to do? Leave him on the mountain to die, or worse, to keep screaming until every infected thing for 5 miles zeroed in on our location? Owen gave him water and food. Graham watched from the doorway of the equipment room. Elaine retreated to the storage room and closed the door. Dennis Carter was a talker, the kind of person who processes fear by filling silence. Over the next hour, he told us everything. His cabin, his supplies, how he'd fortified, and how it hadn't mattered. How they'd come through the walls, how he'd escaped through a basement window, how he'd been walking for 2 days with nothing to eat and no idea where he was going, until he'd picked up our broadcast signal on a pocket AM receiver. And then he said something that stopped me cold. "You know they're coming up the mountain, right?" He said it casually, between sips of water. "I saw them on the way up. Not a lot. Maybe a dozen. Spread out through the trees. They're slow, the ones I saw. But they're moving uphill, like they're following something." "Following what?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't know. The sound, maybe? There's a sound up here, like a hum. You can barely hear it outside, but it's there. The generator. They were following the generator." I looked at Graham. He looked at me. For the first time, his expression was transparent. We were both afraid. That night, I cut the generator to minimum run time. 2 hours in the morning, 1 in the evening. Just enough to run the broadcast, charge our handhelds, and give us light to eat by. The rest of the time, we lived in darkness, with candles, speaking in whispers. It wasn't enough. The infected kept coming. Not in a horde, I want to be clear about that. This wasn't a wave. It was a drift. Each day, when we checked the perimeter from the overlook, there were more of them in the trees. 3 one day, 7 the next, 12. They moved through the forest like fog, slow and dispersed, but always closer, always uphill, and they were changing. I first noticed it on a night when the generator was off, and we were sitting in candlelight. I'd gone to the surface to retrieve a rain collection bucket, and I was moving quietly, slowly, the way we'd all learned to move. The moon was out. I could see the tree line clearly. And there, at the edge of the clearing, I saw 2 infected standing motionless, not shuffling, not swaying. Standing still, facing the bunker entrance, perfectly oriented toward the faint glow of candlelight leaking around the edges of the steel door. They could see light now, or something like seeing. They were responding to the faint visual stimulus in a way they hadn't a week earlier. They were learning, adapting. And if they could track light as well as sound, then even our candles were giving us away. I went back inside and told the others. Owen's face went gray. Dennis started talking, as he always did, suggestions, ideas, plans that were mostly noise. Graham said nothing. Elaine looked at her arm. That's when I asked her, "Elaine, let me see the cut." She looked up at me. Her eyes were clear, focused, and very still. The room went quiet. Owen stopped fiddling with his medical bag. Graham turned from whatever he'd been doing. Dennis's stream of words dried up. "It's fine," she said. Then let me see it. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she slowly rolled up her sleeve. The cut had changed. The edges were dark, not the red of normal inflammation, but something deeper. A purple-black that spread in thin lines away from the wound, like cracks in ice. The skin around it was tight and oddly pale. It didn't look infected in the normal medical sense. It looked like something was growing in it, something that was rewriting the tissue. Owen stood up and approached, professional instinct overriding his fear. He pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves from his pharmacy bag and gently examined the wound. His face told me everything I needed to know before he spoke. "How long has it looked like this?" he asked quietly. 3 days, Elaine whispered. "You said you got this climbing through a window." "I did." "And nothing else happened? Nothing touched you? Nothing bit you or scratched you?" A long silence. "Something grabbed me," she said finally. "When I was going through the window, something grabbed my arm from behind. I pulled free. I thought it was just the glass that cut me." Owen stepped back. He pulled off the gloves carefully, turned them inside out, and placed them in a plastic bag. His hands were steady. His voice was not. "I don't know what this is," he said. "I don't know if it's transmission-based or if it's something else. I don't know the timeline. I don't have the equipment or the knowledge to tell you whether this is progressing or stable or what it means. I'm a pharmacist, not a doctor." "She could turn," Dennis said. Just like that. Blunt, flat, terrified. "She could turn, and we'd all be trapped down here with her." "Shut up," I said. No, I won't shut up. We all saw what those things are. And she's been hiding this for days. Days! She's been sleeping 3 feet from me, and she's got that in her arm, and she didn't say a word. I said, "Shut up." Graham spoke for the first time. "He's not wrong, Marcus." I looked at Graham. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and his expression was the one I'd been trying to identify since the day he arrived. It was the expression of someone who had already made his decision and was waiting for the rest of us to catch up. "We can't keep her in here," Graham said, "not without knowing what that is." "And what do you suggest?" I asked. "Put her outside, in the dark, with them?" "I'm suggesting we think about this clearly." "Clearly," I repeated. "You want to put a living person outside because she has a wound that might be something and might be nothing. And you're calling that clear thinking." "I'm calling it survival." Elaine stood up. She was shaking, but her voice was level. "I'll go to the storage room. You can lock the door from outside. If something happens to me, if I change, I won't be near any of you." That's what we did. We locked a 25-year-old woman in a concrete room with a blanket and a candle and a bottle of water. And we told ourselves it was the reasonable thing to do. I checked on her every 2 hours through the small observation window in the door. She sat on the floor with her back against the shelves and stared at the candle flame. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just sat there, waiting to find out if she was still human. I hated us, all of us, including myself. 2 days passed. Elaine didn't change. The wound on her arm stabilized, the dark lines didn't spread further, the skin didn't worsen. Owen checked her twice a day through the cracked door, and each time he reported the same thing. No progression, no fever, no behavioral changes. She was frightened and exhausted, but she was herself. I let her out on the second morning. Graham objected. Dennis objected louder. I let her out anyway, because leaving her in there any longer would have made me something I wasn't willing to become. But the damage was done. Whatever fragile trust we'd built was broken. Elaine no longer looked any of us in the eye. Owen oscillated between professional concern and naked fear. Dennis watched Elaine constantly, tracking her movements, flinching when she came near. And Graham had become something else. Was entirely. Something I was only beginning to understand. I discovered the transmissions on day 16. I couldn't sleep. I'd been lying on my cot listening to the wind and the distant sound of the generator we were running at overnight, just barely, because the infected outside had multiplied, and total darkness felt too dangerous without at least the possibility of light, when I heard a sound from the equipment room. Not the radio, not the generator. A voice. I got up quietly and moved to the corridor. The equipment room door was ajar, and in the faint glow of the standby lights on the repeater rack, I could see Graham sitting at the desk, hunched over a radio. Not our main set, a different one, smaller. He was speaking quietly, his hand cupped around the microphone, and even though I couldn't make out the words, I could hear the tone. Calm, deliberate, informational. He was giving a report. I pushed the door open. He looked up. No surprise. No guilt this time. He'd moved past that. His expression was almost resigned, as though he'd been expecting this moment and was tired of waiting for it. "Who are you talking to?" I asked. He set the mic down. "People who can help." "What people?" "A group. Organized. They're about 40 miles west, in the old National Guard facility near Barton. They have walls, weapons, medical equipment. They've been consolidating survivors. And you've been telling them about us, about this location. I've been telling them about a relay station with a working antenna and a technician who can operate it. Yes." I stood there in the dim light and tried to organize the betrayal into something I could process. He'd been transmitting our position, our resources, our vulnerabilities. Every night, while we slept, he'd been feeding information to an outside group that none of us had agreed to contact. "They want the tower," I said. It wasn't a question. "They want the communications capability, and they're willing to trade for it. They have things we need. Medicine, fuel, weapons, real security. Not this." He gestured at the bunker around us. "Not this concrete coffin with a failing generator and a dying signal." "What did you promise them?" He didn't answer. "Graham, what did you promise them?" "I told them we'd cooperate. That when they arrived, we'd give them access to the equipment and the antenna, and in exchange, they'd take us in. All of us." "And if we didn't cooperate?" He was quiet for a long time. Then, "They're coming either way, Marcus, with or without our cooperation. I've been trying to make sure it goes well for us. That's all." I wanted to hit him. I've never been a violent person. But in that moment, standing in that room, I wanted to hurt him. Not because he was wrong about our situation, he wasn't. The fuel was running out. The infected were closing in. We were dying slowly on that mountain. But because he'd taken the choice away from us. He'd decided, alone, to sell our position and our only advantage to strangers. And he'd done it in secret and at night, on a radio he'd hidden in his pack since the day he arrived. "How long do we have?" I asked. They said 2 days, maybe 3. I woke the others. I told them everything. Owen sat very still, his hands folded in his lap, processing. Dennis swore and paced and wanted to know if we could block the trail. Elaine said nothing for a long time, and then she said, "Do we know they're actually offering a trade? Or do we only have his word for that?" She was looking at Graham when she said it. He didn't flinch, but I saw his jaw tighten. "I've heard their transmissions," he said. "They're organized. Former military, some of them. They're serious." "Serious about what?" Elaine asked. "Helping us or acquiring this tower?" It was the right question, and none of us had the answer. We argued through the night. Graham maintained that cooperation was our only option. Dennis wanted to abandon the tower entirely and head north, as though there was a north that meant something anymore. Owen, practical as always, wanted to know the exact timeline and the exact terms. And Elaine, who had spent 2 days locked in a room because we were afraid of what she might become, sat against the wall and said the truest thing any of us had said since the collapse began. "We're going to lose this place, no matter what. The generator is failing. The fuel is almost gone. The infected are surrounding us. The question isn't whether we leave. It's whether we leave as people or as things." She was right. But being right didn't help. The generator failed on day 18. Not gradually, not with warning. I was in the equipment room, running the morning broadcast, my voice, tired and hoarse, reading coordinates and safety information into the void when the lights flickered, the radio squealed with feedback, and everything went dark. The generator didn't wind down the way a diesel engine normally does when it runs out of fuel. It seized. I heard the mechanical scream of it, metal on metal, a sound that I recognized immediately as catastrophic internal failure. Piston seizure, probably. The engine had been old, and I'd been running it harder than it was designed for. And now it was dead. Not out of fuel. Dead. Broken in a way that no amount of mechanical skill could fix, without parts that no longer existed in any accessible form. The silence was absolute. I sat in the dark, my hand still on the microphone, and listened to the nothing. No hum, no static, no broadcast signal going out into the world. Just the sound of my own breathing and, somewhere above us, the wind. Owen appeared at the door with a candle. His face floated in the flame like a ghost. "Was that?" "Generator's gone." "Can you fix it?" "No." That single word changed everything. Because without the generator, we had no light except candles, no heat except body warmth and blankets, no radio except the handheld units with their limited battery life, no way to broadcast, no way to monitor frequencies, no way to call for help or guide survivors, or do any of the things that had given us a reason to be on this mountain. We were just people in a hole in the ground, in the dark. The first night without power, I learned what real fear sounds like. It sounds like breathing in the dark and not being sure whose breathing you're hearing. It sounds like the scratch of something against the bunker door, maybe a branch, maybe a hand, maybe nothing. It sounds like Dennis whimpering in his sleep and then going silent in a way that made me crawl across the floor to check that he was still alive. It sounds like Elaine coughing once, just once, and every one of us freezing, because a cough could mean she was turning, could mean the wound had finally won. It sounds like Graham's voice, quiet and measured in the total darkness. "They'll be here soon." The group from the west, the organized people with their walls and their weapons. Graham's salvation or our invasion, depending on which version of reality you trusted. How will they find us without the signal? Owen asked. They have the coordinates, Graham said. They don't need the signal. And if the infected have surrounded the trail? Silence. I spent that night thinking about the service tunnel. The service tunnel was something I hadn't mentioned to the others because, honestly, I'd mostly forgotten about it until the power went out, and I started thinking about exits. It was a leftover from the original Cold War installation. A narrow, concrete-lined passage that ran from the lowest point of the bunker downhill for about a quarter mile, emerging through a concealed hatch on the north side of the ridge. Its original purpose had been emergency evacuation in case the main entrance was compromised. The county had sealed the bunker end with a locked steel grate years ago. But the grate was old, and the lock was a standard padlock that I could cut with the bolt cutters in the equipment room. I didn't tell the others about it immediately. I need you to understand why. It wasn't that I was hoarding an escape route for myself. It was that I'd realized something about our group. We were no longer people who could make decisions together. Graham had his agenda. Dennis was unraveling. Owen was exhausted. Elaine was isolating. And I was trying to hold together a situation that had already collapsed. The tunnel was my contingency, my last card. The next morning, if you could call it morning. Without power, time became a matter of watches and guesses. I took a candle and went to the lowest level of the bunker. The grate was where I remembered it, set into the wall behind a stack of old equipment crates. I moved the crates. The padlock was rusted. I cut it with the bolt cutters, and the grate swung open on corroded hinges, revealing a round concrete tube about 4 feet in diameter, just large enough to crouch walk through. The air that came out was cold, wet, and smelled like stone and old water. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in. I didn't go in, not yet. But I noted the direction, estimated the distance to the exit hatch based on the old facility diagrams I'd seen years ago, and filed the information away. When I returned to the main corridor, Elaine was waiting. She'd been watching. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me, then at the direction I'd come from, and I could see her putting it together. "There's a way out," she said quietly. "Maybe. You weren't going to tell us." "I was going to tell you, not all of us. You." I don't know why I said that. It wasn't a plan. It was instinct. Of the 4 other people in that bunker, Elaine was the one I trusted most, which was ironic given that she was the one with the suspicious wound. But trust by then had stopped being rational. It was animal. It was based on something I couldn't articulate, something about the way she'd endured her isolation, the way she'd asked the right question about Graham's group, the way she'd looked at me just now without demanding or accusing, but simply stating what she'd observed. "We might need to leave fast," I told her. "If Graham's people come and they're not what he promised. Or if the infected breach the door. I need someone who knows the way out." She nodded. "Show me." I showed her the tunnel entrance. I showed her the direction. I told her what I estimated about the exit point. She listened, memorized, and asked one question. How long does a candle last in an enclosed space with limited oxygen? I hadn't thought of that. She had. That's why I trusted her. Day 19. I am counting, though the numbers feel less real with each passing hour. Candlelight flickers. We are rationing the candles as strictly as we ration the fuel. But there are only so many, and each one that burns down is a little more darkness we'll never get back. Dennis has become a problem. Not aggressive, nothing that clean. He's simply come apart. He mutters to himself. He picks at his fingernails until they bleed. He refuses to go near Elaine, but also refuses to let her out of his sight. As though she's a threat he needs to monitor constantly. Owen has tried to talk to him, pharmacist to patient, calm and clinical. But Dennis isn't a patient. He's a frightened man in a dark hole, and the fear has eaten through whatever structural integrity he once had. And then, on the evening of day 19, Dennis told me something that rearranged everything. We were sitting in the corridor, just the two of us. The others were in their respective spaces, Graham in the equipment room, Owen and Elaine in the back room. Dennis was having one of his clearer moments. The paranoia temporarily receded, and he was staring at the candle between us with an almost meditative calm. "I need to tell you something," he said. "About the valley, about my cabin." "Okay." "I said they came through 2 nights before I got here. The infected. I said I escaped through the basement window. That was true, but there's something I left out." He paused. The candle guttered in a draft. "My wife was with me, Laura. She was with me the whole time at the cabin. When they came through, one of them got to her. Through the bedroom window. She screamed, and I ran in and I pulled it off her. But she was already bleeding. Her shoulder, it was bad. Dennis, I bandaged her up. I cleaned it. She was okay for a few hours, and then she wasn't. She got hot. Her eyes went wrong. She stopped recognizing me. I put her in the basement, and I locked the door, and I told myself she was just sick. She just had a fever. She just needed rest." He was crying now, silently, the tears catching candlelight. "She was down there for a day. I brought her water. She didn't drink it. She stood in the corner and she made this sound, not a word, not a scream, just this sound, like humming, like she was trying to remember a song but couldn't find it. And then she stopped making any sound at all, and she just stared at me, through me, and her hand started moving, reaching, and she came toward the door." He stopped. He wiped his face. "I left her there. I locked the door, and I went out the basement window, and I walked up the mountain. I left my wife locked in a basement." I sat with him in silence for a long time. There was nothing to say, nothing that would help, nothing that would undo it. But here's what I was also thinking. The ugly, practical thought that I couldn't stop from forming. Dennis had been in direct contact with an infected person. He'd held her, touched her blood, breathed the same air for hours. If the infection could transmit through a scratch, through a grab through a window the way it had apparently transmitted to Elaine, then Dennis was as much a risk as she was. More, maybe. He'd had prolonged, close exposure. And he'd hidden it. Just like Elaine had hidden her wound. Just like Graham had hidden his transmissions. Every single one of us had secrets. Every single one of us was carrying something that could destroy the group. And the only thing keeping us together was a locked door and a dwindling supply of candles. I didn't tell the others about Dennis's confession. Call it mercy, call it exhaustion, call it the realization that if we started turning on each other over every possible exposure, we'd be dead within hours. Day 20. The infected reached the bunker door. We heard them in the early morning, if it was morning. My watch said it was, but in the perpetual dark, the numbers felt arbitrary. A sound from above, not loud. A soft, persistent tapping, then scraping. Then a low, guttural moan that vibrated through the concrete like a bass note played through a wall. We gathered at the bottom of the stairs and looked up. The heavy steel door was sealed. It was designed to withstand a nuclear blast, or at least the 1960s version of one. It would hold. But the sound of them on the other side was something that lived in a different part of the brain than rational thought. It was primal. It bypassed logic and went straight to the animal core that knows when a predator is at the entrance to your burrow. There were a lot of them. The sound told me that. Not one or two, many. How many, I couldn't say. But the scraping and tapping was continuous. A dozen or more points of contact on the metal surface, and beneath it, that harmonic moan, almost subsonic, a sound I felt in my teeth and my sternum. "They found us," Dennis whispered, unnecessarily. We could all hear it. "The door will hold," I said, unnecessarily. We all hoped so. "For how long?" Graham asked. Not unnecessarily. It was the only question that mattered. The door would hold indefinitely against physical force. They weren't strong enough to breach it, not individually, probably not collectively. But they were patient in a way that living things aren't. They didn't get frustrated. They didn't leave. They just kept applying pressure. Constant, mindless, relentless. And we had to listen to it. The sound did something to us. Not physically, psychologically. It was the sound of being hunted and having nowhere to run. It was the sound of the world outside the door being permanently, irrevocably lost. Every scrape was a reminder that the surface, the sun, the sky, the trees, the wind, was no longer ours. Owen stopped talking. He just stopped. He sat in the back room with his medical bag on his lap and his eyes closed. And when you spoke to him, he answered in monosyllables. Dennis went the other direction. He talked constantly. A stream of consciousness that ranged from memories of his wife to theories about the infection to detailed descriptions of meals he'd eaten years ago. Graham became granite. Hard, silent, watchful, waiting for his people from the west who might or might not be coming. And Elaine sat next to me in the equipment room and said, "The tunnel." "Yeah." "When?" "Soon. Tonight, maybe." "All of us?" I looked at her. In the candlelight, her face was all angles and shadows. She looked older than 25. She looked like someone who had been alive for a very long time. "Everyone who wants to come," I said. I gathered the group in the corridor. I told them about the tunnel. I described the route, the dimensions, the estimated exit point. I showed them the open grate. I explained that I didn't know the condition of the tunnel. It could be collapsed, flooded, or blocked. I explained that we'd be moving in near total darkness in a space too small to stand in, with no guarantee that the exit hatch was still functional. Graham immediately took control, which I expected. He started organizing who would go first, what we'd carry, how we'd manage light. Owen listened and nodded and said he'd bring his medical supplies. Dennis said he wasn't going. He said it flatly, sitting on the floor with his back to the wall. "I'm staying," he said. "Dennis, there's nothing to stay for." "I know." I looked at him. He looked at me. And I understood. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't fear overriding reason. It was a choice. He had left his wife locked in a basement. He had carried that weight up the mountain and through the bunker door and through every dark night since. And now, he was choosing not to carry it any further. You could still, Marcus. His voice was gentle. Go. I left him a candle. 3 of them, actually, and a bottle of water and 2 MREs. I didn't say goodbye because the word felt obscene. I just put my hand on his shoulder for a moment, and he put his hand on mine, and then I turned away and walked to the tunnel. We went in this order. Graham first, he insisted, and I didn't fight it. Then Owen, then Elaine. I went last, pulling the grate closed behind us out of some irrational sense of tidiness, like closing the door when you leave a house for the last time. The tunnel was exactly as bad as I'd feared. 4 feet in diameter, unlit, the concrete walls slick with condensation and in places coated with a pale mineral deposit that looked like bone in the candlelight. We moved on hands and knees, each person holding a candle or a flashlight. We had 2 small flashlights between us, plus 4 candles. The air was thick and still and tasted like metal. Every few yards, water pooled on the floor, shallow but cold, seeping through our knees and palms. We moved in silence. The only sounds were our breathing, our shuffling, and the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. The tunnel was straight, which was a small mercy. No turns to navigate, no choices to make. Just forward, always forward, toward whatever was at the other end. After what felt like an hour, but was probably 20 minutes, Graham stopped. There's something ahead, he whispered. A hatch. The exit. We gathered behind him in the cramped space. 4 people hunched in a concrete tube, breathing each other's air. Graham examined the hatch by flashlight. It was a circular steel plate set into the ceiling of the tunnel, secured by a wheel mechanism like a submarine door. He gripped the wheel and turned. Nothing. It didn't move. He tried again, harder. I could see the muscles in his arms straining, the tendons in his neck standing out. The wheel didn't budge. Rust, I said. It's been sealed for decades. Let me... I crawled forward, and Graham and I positioned ourselves side by side, both gripping the wheel. On 3, we turned. I felt something give a grinding, reluctant shift, and then the wheel moved, slowly, fighting us for every degree of rotation. We turned it a full revolution, then another, and the hatch lifted with a sound like a gasp. Cold air rushed in. Night air, carrying the smell of pine and wet earth and something else. Something faintly chemical that I didn't recognize. Graham pushed the hatch open and climbed out. After a moment, his hand appeared, beckoning. We emerged one by one into the night. The exit was where I'd estimated, the north side of the ridge, in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. The hatch was concealed beneath a rusted metal cover that had been overgrown with vegetation. Stars were visible between the branches. The wind was blowing from the west. We stood there in the dark, 4 people on a mountain, with nothing behind us and nothing ahead. The bunker was lost. The tower was lost. The broadcast was silent. And from somewhere below us, down the mountain, I heard a sound. An engine, vehicles, coming up the mountain road. Graham's face changed. In the moonlight, I could see something shift behind his eyes, relief, calculation, and something else. Something that looked like the expression of a man whose investment was about to pay off. That's them, he said. That's my people. Your people, Elaine repeated. Our rescue. He was already moving toward the sound. Come on, we need to get to the road. Wait, I said. We don't know. I know exactly who they are, Marcus. I've been talking to them for 2 weeks. They have a convoy. They have weapons. They have a plan. This is what I've been working toward. I grabbed his arm. You've been working toward this? This has been your plan since you got here? He stopped, turned, and in the moonlight, with the sound of engines growing louder, he told me the truth. Not all of it, but enough. I wasn't a park ranger, Marcus. I was an intelligence analyst for the State Emergency Management Office. When the outbreak began, I was tasked with identifying surviving communication assets. Your tower was on a list. I was sent to secure it and report to command. When I realized the command structure had collapsed, I contacted the group at Barton because they were the closest organized force. I told them what was here: a working relay tower, a functioning antenna, and a technician who could operate it. You were never a survivor, I said. You were an asset acquisition. I was trying to save all of us. By lying to us. By doing what needed to be done. He pulled his arm free. Those vehicles have enough fuel and supplies to keep us alive for months. They have a doctor. They have walls. All they want is the tower and someone to run it. The tower is surrounded by infected. The generator is dead. They're bringing a new generator. And soldiers who know how to clear a perimeter. They need the antenna, Marcus. It's the only relay in range that can reach the eastern networks. Without it, an entire region goes dark. I stood there on the mountain in the cold and the dark and tried to think. The engines were closer now. I could see headlight beams sweeping through the trees below. Graham was already walking toward the fire trail. Marcus, Elaine's voice behind me, quiet, steady. If they want the tower, they'll take it whether you cooperate or not. The question is, what happens to us after they have what they want? Owen stood between us, his medical bag clutched to his chest, saying nothing, waiting. What do you want to do? I asked Elaine. I want to survive, but not like this. Not by being handed from one person's agenda to another's. Graham was 30 yards away now, waving toward the headlights. I made my decision. The last real decision I made on that mountain. Owen, Elaine, go north, down the ridge, through the trees, toward the valley. There's a Forest Service road about 2 miles north that connects to the county highway. Stay quiet. Stay off the main road. Move at night. What about you? Owen asked. I looked at the headlights. At Graham, now visible in their beams, arms raised, walking toward the vehicles. I'm going to talk to them. If they're what Graham says they are, I'll help them get the tower running. If they're not, I'll buy you time. Marcus, go, now, while they're focused on the trail. Elaine took my hand. She squeezed it once, hard. Then she and Owen melted into the trees. I walked down toward the headlights. There were 3 vehicles, military surplus. By the look of them, 2 Humvees and a cargo truck. The headlights were blinding after days in the dark. I raised my hands and walked into the light. And the figures standing around the vehicles turned toward me, armed, watchful, silhouetted. A woman stepped forward, tall, wearing a tactical vest, her hair pulled back. She looked at me, then at Graham, then at me again. You're the technician, she said. Not a question. Marcus Hale. Can you get the antenna running? The generator's dead. We brought one. Can you get the antenna running? Maybe. The tower's surrounded. Dozens of infected on the perimeter. They're drawn to sound. Your engines are probably pulling more right now. She nodded, as though this was expected. Then she looked at one of her people and made a gesture I didn't understand. And 3 of them moved toward the trail with a quiet efficiency that told me everything about what kind of group this was. "Where are the others?" she asked. "Graham said there were 5 of you. 1 stayed in the bunker, 2 went north." "Why?" "Because they didn't trust this." She studied me. "And you?" "I'm here." "Why?" I thought about it. The real answer was complicated and tangled and had to do with my mother and Dennis's wife and Elaine's arm and the woman on the radio asking about children and the 11 people who never arrived, and the oscillating tone that I'd heard in the dead of night that sounded like something trying to communicate. But the answer I gave was simpler. Because someone needs to keep the signal alive. She almost smiled. Almost. Then she turned and began issuing orders. And I was folded into an operation that had been planned long before I knew it existed. They cleared the perimeter in hours. I don't know how. I was in the bunker by then, working by flashlight, preparing the antenna connection for their new generator. I heard sounds from outside. Not gunfire, something else, concussive, rhythmic, controlled. Whatever methods they used, by dawn the infected were gone from the clearing, and the mountain was quiet again. I found Dennis where I'd left him. He was sitting against the wall in the corridor with 2 of the 3 candles burned down to nothing, and the 3rd still flickering. He was alive. He looked at me without surprise, as though he'd been waiting. "You came back," he said. "I came back." "Did you find what's out there?" "People, an organized group. They're taking over the tower." He nodded slowly. "Good. Someone should use it." They set up their generator, a military-grade unit, quieter and more efficient than our old diesel. The repeater came back online. The antenna began transmitting again. And for a moment, in the cold morning light, I stood at the base of the tower and listened to the signal going out, and felt something that I think was relief. But here's the thing. Here's what I haven't told you yet. The night before the group arrived, during those final hours in the dark bunker with the infected scraping at the door, I'd heard the oscillating tone one last time. This time, it was coming through our handheld unit, the one I'd kept powered off to conserve battery. It was off. The unit was off, and the tone was coming through it anyway. Low and pulsing, that 4-second cycle, rising and falling like breathing. And this time, the voice underneath it was clear. It said my name. Not Marcus, not Hale. It said the name my mother used for me when I was a child. A name no one else alive would know. A name that had no business coming through a dead radio on a dark mountain. I've thought about this every day since. I've run every explanation. Residual charge in the circuit, auditory hallucination from sleep deprivation and stress. Pareidolia in the static, the human tendency to hear patterns and noise. All plausible, all probably true. But here's the other thing. The morning after the group arrived and the tower was operational again, one of their communications people was calibrating the antenna and picked up the same oscillating signal. He called me over. "You ever hear this before?" he asked. "Yes." "Any idea what it is?" "No." He frowned at his equipment. "It's not coming from a transmitter. At least, not any kind I recognize. The signal characteristics are wrong. It's modulated, but the modulation pattern doesn't match any known protocol. And the frequency, it's not on any allocation chart I've ever seen. What do you think it is? He looked at me with an expression I recognized because I'd felt it myself. The look of a technical person encountering something that doesn't fit into any of his categories. I think something is transmitting, he said, but I don't think it's a machine. I stayed at the tower for 3 more days. I got their systems running. I trained 2 of their people on the equipment. I ate their food and slept in their cots and answered their questions about frequencies and propagation and antenna gain and all the things I knew how to do. And then I left. I told the woman in the tactical vest her name was Reeves. She never offered a first name that I was going north. She asked why. I said I had people to find. She didn't try to stop me. She gave me a pack with food and water and a handheld radio and spare batteries. If you find a working relay, call us, she said. We need more towers. I walked off the mountain on a Tuesday morning. The sky was clear. The air was cold. I took the North Ridge route, the same path I'd sent Owen and Elaine down 3 days earlier. And I followed the faint trail through the trees, listening for sounds, watching for movement, alive in the way that only people who have nearly stopped being alive can be. I never found Owen and Elaine. I found the Forest Service road. I found signs that someone had passed through a wrapper, a footprint, a branch broken at walking height. But I never found them. I hope they made it. I think about them at night when the silence gets heavy, and I hope I never found my mother. I went back to Harlow 3 weeks later when I'd worked up the courage. Pinecrest Gardens was empty. The doors were open. The hallways were dark and smelled like something I won't describe. Her room was vacant. The bed was made. Her photograph of my father was still on the nightstand. I don't know if she walked out, or was carried, or was led by someone who cared enough to take her hand. I don't know if she's one of them now, shuffling through some empty town with my father's name on her lips. I don't know. And the signal, the oscillating tone, the voice underneath it, I still hear it sometimes. Late at night, on certain frequencies, in certain weather conditions, it rises and falls like breathing. And I listen, because listening is what I do. It's what I've always done. I'm recording this from a basement in a town whose name doesn't matter, on a battery that's almost dead, for an audience that may not exist. The tower at Caldwell Ridge is still broadcasting. I can hear it on my scanner, faint but steady. Reeves's people sending their message into the dark. I don't know if it's helping. I don't know if any of this helped. But I'll tell you what I believe. I believe that the signal matters. Not because it saves everyone. It didn't save the 11 people who never arrived. It didn't save Dennis's wife. It didn't save my mother. It didn't even save me. Not really. Not in the way that matters. But it existed. It went out into the air and it said, someone is here. Someone is alive. Someone is listening. And sometimes, from very far away, something answers back. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it wants. I don't know if it was ever human. But it knows my name. The battery light on this recorder is blinking. I have maybe 5 minutes of power left. So I'll finish with this. If you're hearing this and you're alive, and you have a radio, turn it on. Find a frequency, any frequency, and listen. Not for voices, not for instructions, not for rescue. Listen for the tone. 4 seconds, rising and falling, like a breath. And if you hear it, do not answer. Do not transmit. Do not make a sound. Just listen. And then run. This is Marcus Hale, Caldwell Ridge Relay Station. Signing off. Whatever's left of me, this is all I have to give. I hope it finds you. I hope you're somewhere safe. I hope the candles last. But if they don't, if the dark comes and the signal fades and the silence swallows everything, remember this. We tried. We kept the tower alive as long as we could. We put a voice into the nothing. And for a while, the nothing listened. That has to count for something. Hale out.